Okay, let's dive into this, because today we are looking at a moment in time that literally upended everything the world thought it knew about power, geography, and empires. We're going to examine the mechanics of what I can only describe as a geopolitical earthquake. Seriously, imagine a scenario where this unstoppable imperial force, a power completely used to just getting its way on a global scale, suddenly comes face to face with an ancient kingdom that flat out refuses to bow. This isn't just a story about a single battle. It's an absolute masterclass in strategy and resilience that permanently changed how we view global power dynamics.
So, I want you to really picture this scene. It's March 1st, 1896. The morning air over the incredibly rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia is just biting cold. And standing there, in strict, disciplined formation, are thousands of Italian soldiers. I mean, their rifles are polished to a shine, their artillery is prepped and ready, and their uniforms, absolutely immaculate. The commanders looking out over these troops are just brimming with confidence. In their minds, this wasn't supposed to be a difficult campaign at all. Europe had already carved up most of the continent, so to Italy, Ethiopia was simply the next piece of the puzzle. It was just one more kingdom to conquer, one more colony to claim for the empire. But as the first rays of sunlight crept over those jagged mountains surrounding the town of Adwa, something became terrifyingly clear to the Italian forces. The landscape around them wasn't empty. They hadn't come to just seamlessly conquer Ethiopia. No, they had walked directly into a massive, brilliantly orchestrated trap. In a flash, the confident, swaggering march of a European empire had turned into a desperate fight for survival.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how quickly things fell apart for them. Because by the time the sun set on that single day, the reality on the ground was completely unrecognizable. Over 6,000 Italian soldiers lay dead. Thousands more were forced to surrender. An army that marched in that morning with polished rifles and absolute certainty was utterly decimated in just a matter of hours. It's actually mind-blowing.
Now you have to understand, the implications of this defeat went way, way beyond the borders of Ethiopia. This stunning victory completely shattered a deeply held global myth. The idea that European armies could literally never lose to an African nation. Gone. Shattered. The town where this happened, Adwa, instantly became a name etched into world history. But to truly grasp how this incredible upset actually happened, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the world as it existed just before this battle.
Let's look at Section 1, the scramble for Africa and a disappearing continent. So, in the late 19th century, the continent of Africa was practically disappearing from the political map. And the speed of this colonization? It was staggering. Between 1884 and 1885, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference to establish the literal rules for claiming African territory. This basically hit the fast-forward button on what became known as the scramble for Africa. Borders were arbitrarily drawn with absolutely no regard for the people who actually lived there. You had Britain ruling Egypt, France aggressively pushing across West Africa, Belgium claiming the vast Congo, and Germany planting its flag in East Africa. Within just a few decades, nearly the entire continent had fallen under European control.
But there was one glaring exception, which brings us to this incredibly fascinating contrast. On one side, we have Ethiopia. To the colonial powers, Ethiopia was a total anomaly. It was the last free kingdom, fiercely protected by these massive, rugged mountains. It boasted an ancient lineage stretching way back to antiquity, churches that had stood for centuries, and an army with a deep military tradition of fighting off invaders long before modern Europe even existed. And on the other side, we have Italy. Now, Italy was one of Europe's newest unified nations. Unlike Britain or France, they only had a modest empire. They were basically the new kid on the imperial block, and they were absolutely desperate for a colonial participation trophy to prove they belonged among Europe's heavy hitters. To them, unconquered Ethiopia was just unfinished business.
Which brings us to Section 2, the strategist emperor, Menelik II.
Far away from the grand palaces of Europe, Emperor Menelik II was carefully watching all these events unfold. Unlike a lot of rulers who were just blindsided by this sudden wave of European expansion, Menelik did not underestimate the threat at all. Instead, he carefully read the geopolitical chessboard. He fully understood that European rifles, modern artillery, and industrial production had totally transformed the nature of warfare. But he also understood something just as critical. European empires were bitter rivals. He saw that Britain distrusted France. He knew France competed directly with Italy. He recognized that Russia was aggressively seeking its own influence. Menelik realized a fundamental truth. No single European power wanted to see a rival become too dominant. It was a classic balancing act. So how did he use this? Well, this understanding translated into a brilliant survival strategy. Step 1. Instead of isolating Ethiopia out of fear, he actively exploited those European tensions. Step 2. He quietly went out to the global market and bought modern rifles and artillery from multiple competing countries. This was a genius move because it ensured he wasn't dependent on just one supplier. And step 3, he used these new tools to expand and consolidate his own kingdom. Menelik was meticulously preparing for a war that he firmly believed was inevitable. For him, the question wasn't if Italy would come, it was when. And that leads right into Section 3, the deceptive Treaty of Wuchale, signed in 1889. Okay, this next chapter, it's basically a 19th century legal thriller. On paper, Menelik and Italy signed what looked like a perfectly straightforward agreement. It promised all the right things, right? Mutual friendship, international recognition, lucrative trade, lasting peace, the whole shebang. So the crucial point is that hidden in the translation was a massive, massive discrepancy. You see, the treaty was written in 2 languages. In the Italian language version, it explicitly stated that Ethiopia must conduct all of its foreign affairs through Italy. That single word, must, effectively stripped Ethiopia of its independence and turned it into an Italian protectorate. But the Amharic language version, the one Menelik actually read and agreed to, stated that Ethiopia could, if it wished, use Italy for diplomatic representation. It's wild. One version literally stole a nation's sovereignty and the other completely preserved it. So naturally, using their version of the text, Italy proudly goes around announcing to all of Europe that Ethiopia had officially become its protectorate. And when Menelik found out, he was absolutely outraged. I mean, from his perspective, Ethiopia had never and would never surrender its independence to anyone. This incredibly deceptive semantic trap meant that the Treaty of Wuchale hadn't created peace at all. Diplomacy had fundamentally failed, and instead, this treaty had planted the direct seeds of a massive war.
And that brings us right to the precipice of the conflict. Italy, realizing that their little diplomatic trickery wasn't going to force Menelik into submission, decides that military action is the only path forward. But in response to this existential threat, Menelik doesn't just roll over and surrender. No way. Instead, he sends messengers sprinting across the vast mountainous terrain of Ethiopia, summoning his entire empire to war. The trap at Edwa is being set. Tens of thousands of warriors are hearing the summons. So here's the big question to leave you with. Will a unified African empire answer the call in time to crush a modern European army? And what happens to the whole global order when these supposedly invincible empires realize they can actually bleed? That tension, that unknown, is exactly what makes the Battle of Adwa one of the most thrilling moments in history. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.